So we'll start there then. Titus chapter 2. And I'll just read again those verses that have been our text. So Titus 2, 11 down to 15 it is, isn't it? Titus 2, verse 11, for the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, teaching us that, denying ungodliness and worldly lusts, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in the present age, looking for the blessed hope and glorious appearing of our great God and Saviour Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from every lawless deed and purify for himself his own special people, zealous for good works. Speak these things, exhort and rebuke with all authority, let no one despise you. And we've had, from that little section, we've taken the idea of grace, our teacher, and we are focusing on how grace teaches us to live in the here and now, how grace teaches us to live in the present age. And we've seen those three terms: soberly, righteously, godly. And what we've focused on so far is the word soberly. And we've seen that soberly means sound-minded, right thinking. And Titus is full of references to sober thinking. And last Sunday, we looked at 2 Timothy 1, verse 7, which talks about God is not giving us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. So sound-mindedness is what grace will teach us to have. It's the way to think about ourselves biblically, and to think about ourselves as we are in Christ. Now, when you start a series and you start looking at a particular word like we are, you never know where you might end up. And what I want us to do as we end the Sunday night services now for the month of August, I want us to turn to a passage where the idea of sober-mindedness is right at the heart of the narrative. And the passage is in Mark's Gospel. It's also in Matthew's Gospel. It's in Luke's Gospel. But we'll focus on the one that is in Mark's Gospel. And the passage itself is a huge challenge to make sense of. So we'll turn to it. It's in Mark 5. And it's the story of the Gadarene demoniac, the person in the area of the Gadarene who was possessed by demons. Let's turn to him. And what I want to do tonight is notice the word sober-minded, same word that you have in Titus 2, verse 12. Here it is, describing him. I want to set the whole thing out for you, and then I'm going to leave you to ponder it for the whole of the month of August. So my aim would be to show you the way that Mark tells the story of this man, how he sets it all out, and then I want you to figure it out over the weeks to come. So let's turn to the account itself, and it's Mark 5. And what I want you to notice is we have the word sound-minded. Okay, we have it in verse 15. So turn to Mark chapter 5 and verse 15. So just to notice the sober, sound-mindedness in this verse, and then we'll read the whole thing. So verse 15 says, then they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had the legion. And there he was, sitting and clothed in his right mind. And they were afraid. So there's the phrase now: sober, sound-minded, right-minded. It's a description of this man after the deliverance he had experienced at the hands of Jesus. So note that then, and let's read the full account. Mark 5 and the first verse. Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. And when he, that's Jesus, had come out of the boat, immediately there met with him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains. And the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. And he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, that you do not torment me." But Jesus said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Then he asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Also, he earnestly begged him that he would not send them out of the country. Now, a large herd of swine was feeding there near the mountains. So all the demons begged him, saying, "Send us to the swine, that we may enter them." And at once Jesus gave them permission. And so the unclean spirits went out and entered the swine. They were about 2,000. And the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea and drowned in the sea. So those who fed the swine fled, and they told it in the city and in the country. And they went out to see what it was that had happened. Then they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had the legion sitting and clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who saw it told them how it happened to him who had been demon-possessed and about the swine. Then they began to plead with him to depart from their region. And when he got into the boat, he who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has compassion on you." And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. Now, where do you begin to make sense of such an event? Why are we here? We are here because we've pursued a word, the word soberly or sound-mindedness. And we've pursued that word as it's taken us from Titus into Romans, then to Timothy, then to Corinthians. And here now, in our pursuit of an understanding of the word, we come to Mark 5 and the story of this man. Now, I'm not suggesting by any stretch that we need to kind of identify with this man. And we will have sound-mindedness because we once had demons. I'm not suggesting anything of the kind. What I am saying is pursuing this word has led us here. And as we are here, let's try and make sense of a very puzzling and very troubling moment in the ministry of Jesus. And it's so significant, this moment, that both Matthew and Luke tell the same story. They have variations, but it's essentially the same story. So I want us to set it up so that we have all that we need in order to reflect on this story and to do that reflecting over the weeks to come. So let's try and do three things with this story. I want to put it into a context. The second thing is I want us to look at the background to this story. Now, I've got a very sneaky feeling that we might not actually get to the background tonight because the context is huge and there's so much to say about it. So context, background, and then the third thing to do, and that's the bit that I want you to do, is to interpret it. What does this passage tell us? What are we meant to learn about it? So context, background. I'm going to try and do that tonight. And then it's over to you to think about this passage now throughout the month and to come to the lessons that we need to learn. So if you want to start with a context for this, this is a little mini section of Mark's Gospel that runs from chapter 4 and verse 35 all the way to the end of chapter 5. So think of that bit of the Gospel as standing on its own. And what we have in this section of Mark's Gospel is an introduction. So chapter 4, verses 35 to 41 is an introduction to the person of Jesus. It's the crossing of the lake. So this entire section centers around a lake. Jesus crosses it in one direction and he meets this man from the region of Gadara. Then he crosses it back and we go into the rest of chapter 5. So it's all set around a lake and it's introduced by Jesus on that lake, rowing with his disciples, and there's a storm and there's the wind and it's evening and Jesus stills the storm. Now that's the setting for this little section. And then the section itself, if you like, what happens is the whole of chapter 5, and we have 3 individuals whom Jesus meets. He meets them one by one. And the first of the individuals he meets is this man, and that's from verse 1 down to verse 20, this man who's demon possessed. He's the first of them. So Jesus very specifically gets into a boat, crosses the lake, goes to this region, meets this man, delivers him of the demon, and then gets back into the boat and then sails back across the lake. And when he arrives back to where he started, he then meets the second individual in this little section of the gospel, and that's Jairus. And Jairus and his daughter is at the point of death. She's 12 years old. So the story of Jairus is chapter 5, verse 22 down to verse 24, and then there's an interruption. And we get the third character whom we meet in this little section of the gospel. And that's the woman with an issue of blood, a woman who's been hemorrhaging for some period of time. And her story is verse 25, right down to verse 34, where Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well, go in peace." And then we take up again the story of Jairus and his daughter. And by the time we take that story up, his daughter has died. And so as you look at verse 35, we go back to Jairus there. While Jesus was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" And the story of Jairus and his daughter then is completed. And to the point we get to the end of the chapter. So use a section. The introduction focuses on Jesus and how amazed everybody is by Jesus. Then we meet a man who's demon possessed, a man whose daughter is dying, and a woman hemorrhaging blood. Now, what I want you to think about in terms of this section of Mark's Gospel is compare those stories, those 3 individuals, and contrast them. When you compare them, what do these stories have in common? And then when you make a contrast between them, what's the differences and what do you discover? So there's your task number 1, guys. I'm giving you lots of homework to get on with, if you like, throughout the month of August. So take those 3 individual tales, 3 individuals with different needs, all who meet Jesus, and Jesus is able to meet their needs and to answer their concerns. What can we learn from them? Okay, that's your first task. Now, when it comes to the second thing I want you to think about is we've got to look more closely at the story of this man who is possessed, the story of the Gadarene. And that story, as you've seen, is from verse 1 down to verse 20 of Mark 5. And what we have in this one story are 3 scenes. Okay, one story 3 scenes, and what I want you to notice is each scene repeats itself, okay? So there are 3 scenes in this one story. Now, what we'll do once I finish laying it all out for you, is we'll talk it through together, so that if I've said too much or said it too quickly, we can go over it again. But I want us all to be as familiar as we can with the context, so that we can then think this through together. So just now then, focusing on the story of the Gadarene itself, Mark tells the story by setting it in 3 scenes, okay? So the first scene is from verse 1 of chapter 5, and it's down to verse 10. Now that's your first scene, okay? So just mark that in your Bible, scene 1, or if you want, act 1, okay, of this drama, this man who is possessed. There's your first act. Then scene 2 or act 2 is from verse 11 of Mark 5, and it takes us down as far as verse 17. There's act 2, scene 2, whichever you prefer, okay? And then the third act, I think act is probably a better way of describing, is verses 18 through to 20. So it's a shorter one, but it's the most important of these 3 acts, okay? So the story of the Gadarene in 3 acts. Now, each of the acts has the same shape to it, okay? It tells the story in the same way. So let me see if I can show it to you. In your first act then, from verse 1 down to verse 10, what you have first of all is the setting of the scene. Do you notice how Mark tells the story? So, Mark 5 verse 1, then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes, and he came out of the boat. That's the scene being set for you, okay? You know where you are, you know what's going on. We're all ready for the unfolding of the first act of this drama, the setting of the scene. And then from Mark 5 verse 2 down to verse 5, we have a description of the main character for Act 1. And just notice how he is described. So they met him out of the tombs, a man with an unclean spirit, dwelling among the tombs. No one could bind him, not even with chains. He had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart. Out of the tombs he came. So there's the description of our main character. First act, the description of the main character. What do you then have? You then have from verse 6 down to verse 9 is you have dialogue. That's the next bit of Act 1. A conversation between Jesus and this man, between Jesus and the demons, if you like. Notice the dialogue, hugely important. Verse 6 down to verse 9. Say verse 7 down to verse 9. And then the whole act finishes with this idea of going out, sending out. Verse 10. He begged him earnestly that he would not send them out of the country. Now, that's a very odd verse. We can talk about it in more detail, but all I want you to get at this point is a sense of how Mark tells the story. He introduces it, sets the scene. Then the next thing he does is he introduces the character. Then we have dialogue. And then finally, we have this idea of leaving, not wanting to depart the country. All of that, those 4 ideas in Act 1 will be found in Act 2, and they'll be found in Act 3. Exactly the same idea. So let me see if I can show you. Go to verse 11 of chapter 5. This is where Act 2 begins. Now, what would you expect? You'd expect Mark to set the scene. And that's exactly what he does in Mark 5 and verse 11. The setting of the scene. A large herd of swine was feeding there near to the mountains. And then what you get in the next bit, 12 and 13, is you get this idea of the main character. So in the first act, the main character was the man. In the second act, who's the main character, if you like? And the main character there, if you like, the whole idea is verse 12, verse 13, the main focus, the main person, if you can use the word person, let's think character, it's the swine, okay? So we get all this reference in verse 12, send us to the swine that we may enter them. And at once Jesus gave them permission. They went out and they entered the swine. There were 2,000 of them and they ran down. So there's the main character, the main person in this drama, if you like, in Act chapter 2. That's the next bit. Now, what are we going to expect as the third element of Act 2? Well, it's got to be dialogue. It's going to be conversation of some kind. And what do we get? Verse 15 and 16. When they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had the legion sitting and clothed in his right mind, they were afraid. They saw it and they told them how it happened to him who had been demon-possessed and told him about the swine. So there is the told them, the talking part of the scene. How is it going to end? Well, if you look, it's going to end in exactly the same way as the first act end. It's going to be something to do with leaving. And what do we get? They began to plead with him to depart from their region. So just like Act 1 ended with, don't send us away, here now the crowd of the keepers of the swine and the people who lived in the city, they are pleading with Jesus to leave their region. Can you see how the first act ends and the second act ends with this idea of leaving? So that brings us to Act number 3. How's this going to work out? Well, you want setting the scene, you want the main character, you want a conversation, and you want something about leaving, okay? Those are the 4 elements of each of the acts. Well, come to Act 3 and look out for those 4 things. Where's the setting of the scene? Who's the main character? Where's the conversation? And where's the bit about leaving? You see those 4 ideas in each of the acts. So let's look for them then in Act 3. Act 3 then is verses 18 to 19. What's the setting of the scene? Well, you see it in verse 18. When he got into the boat. So there's the scene. First act, he got out of the boat. Third act, he gets into the boat. The scene is set. We know where we are. We know the location for the happenings. So there's the setting of the scene. Then you want, who's the main character? Well, take a look at it then. Verse 18, he who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. So the main character now is the first one from the first act. It's the man. So he's the main character in the first act, in chains, in tombs, self-harming, not able to be contained, cast out. And now in Act 3, we got the same main character, but look at the difference in the main character this time. He's there for us, isn't he? In Act 3, he who had been demon-possessed. Now, the next thing you want to look for is dialogue. Where's the conversation? Well, it's between this man and it's between Jesus again. He begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, and here's the recorded dialogue, go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you. So there is the dialogue, and we've got the words of Jesus recorded for us. We don't know what the man said exactly, just the idea of the conversation, but the words of Jesus are clearly stated for us. So you've had the dialogue. Now, how do you expect the scene to end? How did Act 1 end? How did Act 2 end? It ends with the idea of departure. Well, what do we get? Verse 20. He departed and began to proclaim. Who's departed? Well, it's the man. He departs. He departs and begins to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. Now, I really hope you see, because it depends whether I've explained it clearly or not, how each of the acts has exactly the same sense, the same layout. Let me just repeat it. You set the scene, you see the main character, there's a dialogue, and then there's something about leaving. And as you see that each of the scenes has that same pattern, what you need now to think about is, now why is Mark telling the story in that way? Why is he repeating, like a rhythm, the same way of telling the story, setting different scenes, bringing in the man, then there's herd, then the man, then we have conversations, then in Act 1, let us go. The demons, let us go into the swine. They don't want to depart the country. And then Act 2, the people come and they say, leave our country. And then Act 3, the man goes and tells everybody what Jesus had done for him. You've got 3 ideas of leaving. Okay. Now, as you put all that together, what's Mark doing? I want to just show you 1 or 2 more things, and then I leave it for you to decide. I want you to notice, first of all, something about the keepers of the swine and the people who lived in the nearest town. Just take a note of them. So this is now Act 2, I think, isn't it? So let's take a look. Verse 14. So those who fed the swine fled, and they told it in the city and in the country. And then those in the city and the country went out to see what it was that had happened. Then they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had the legion, sitting and clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who saw it told them how it had happened. So what that means is the keepers of the herd saw the demons enter the swine run down the cliff and jump into the sea. They saw that and they ran into the town and they said, quick, everybody, come out to the fields where we were keeping our swine. Something tremendous has happened. So everybody runs out to the field and they see the man that they've been terrified of for years, dressed and in his right mind, and so they have to find out what's happened, and then there's this back and forth between the keepers of the swine and the people who lived in the towns. So take a look at the next verse, 16. Those who saw it told them how it happened to him who had been demon-possessed, and about the swine. Then they began to plead with him to depart from their region. Now, isn't the Bible wonderful? What does all that remind you of? Mark is giving you an almost identical telling of a story that you'll encounter somewhere else in one of the other Gospels, and he's telling it in reverse. So where else do you find a story about men keeping their animals, and they run to see the scene, to see what had happened, and they are greatly afraid. And when they run and see and they find Jesus, and then they go and they tell, which story, guys, are we being reminded of here in the way that Mark tells the story of the keepers of the swine? Now, you all know it. You're very familiar with it. It's a story that you'll look at least once a year, which has people looking after their animals, amazed, and they come and they find Jesus. Now, that story that Matthew is reflecting here is hugely important to make sense of what's going on in Mark 5. Okay, so I'm sure you know it. I can tell by your faces you do. Okay, so these keepers of the swine, they are that other story from a different gospel in reverse. Okay, so they, instead of going out and telling everybody, they come to Jesus and they tell him to leave. So who's the one who's going to go out then and tell everybody. Well, it's our friend, isn't it? It's the guy who had the demons. He then goes and he then does what that other gospel story about men who've been looking after their animals go and do. Can you see the connections? And they're very clear and they're very real and they're very important in order to make sense of what's going on here. Okay, so I haven't told you, but I'm sure you know exactly what I'm referring to. Now, other thing to note, just in this whole wonderful, confusing, difficult story, the most important bit that stands out of these three acts, and how each act is shaped in exactly the same way as each other, the thing that stands out in the whole of it, I'm sure you've worked it out, are the words of Jesus at the end. So verse 19, it's in Act 3. It's to do with it's at the end of the whole drama. The words of Jesus are the most important element in this story here. So let's look at them again and see what you notice. Verse 19 of Mark 5. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had compassion on you. Now, do you notice how every act ends with the idea of wanting to go? So the demons are to go, and the crowd says to Jesus to go in Act 2, and then at the end of Act 3, Jesus will go. He'll get in the boat and he'll go. So every act ends with going. What's going on in verse 19 then? If every act ends with something departing and leaving, what goes on in verse 19? And what you notice then in verse 19 is the whole aim of this story. So what happens there in comparison to the departing bit, okay? And then look at what Jesus says. Tell your friends. Now, what friends? This man had been in the tombs with chains. He'd been harming himself with stones. What friends? Go and tell your friends the great things the Lord has done for you. Is Jesus talking about himself there? Is he referring to himself as the Lord? Or is he talking about God, the Lord, Yahweh, Jehovah? Okay? Go tell your friends what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he, now why would Jesus talk about himself as he? How he had compassion on you. So if Jesus is talking about God the Lord, Yahweh the Lord, it's God the Lord who has had compassion on this man. And Jesus was the one who brought that compassion to the man. But Jesus wants the man to go and talk about God to his friends and to his neighbors, and the compassion of God on him in his condition. Okay? So put all these things together, everyone. And don't forget, now we can have a conversation in a minute in case any of us have got lost. But put all these things together and say, this is the context of the story. What can we learn? One more thing, though. What's the background? And there's a wonderful background to this story that you find in the book of Isaiah. So, just as a last thing then, turn to Isaiah to get the background. And the background to this entire event is found in Isaiah and chapter 65. And I'll just read a few of the verses. You need to read the whole of the chapter. But if I just read a few of the verses, this is going to be a big help in making sense of what happens on this occasion in Mark 5. So you found Isaiah 65 then? Let me read it out to you. I was sought by those who did not ask for me. I was found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation that was not called by my name. I have stretched out my hands all day long to a rebellious people who walk in a way that is not good, according to their own thoughts, a people who provoke me to anger continually to my face, who sacrifice in gardens and burn incense on altars of brick. Now get ready for it. Who sit among the graves and spend the night in the tombs, who eat swine's flesh, and the broth of abominable things is in their vessels, who say, keep to yourself. Do not come near me. That's what they've been saying to this man in Gadarene all along. For I am holier, that's the people living in the cities and the villages, I am holier than you. These are smoke in my nostrils, a fire that burns all the day. Now, do you notice how specific it is? Spend the night in tombs, eat swine's flesh, who say, stay away, keep to yourself, go, because we are holier than you. How specific is all of that in terms of unlocking what's going on in Mark 5? So there you are, everyone. The context, the background. All you guys need to now go and do is work it out. What's the story telling us? So just a brief recap. It's a section of Mark's Gospel from chapter 4, in that middle bit to the end of chapter 5, in which Jesus is introduced to us as the man who stills the storm. And then we got the three stories of three individuals. Look at those, see the similarities, and see the differences. Then go down into the story of the Gadarene and look at it. It's a story in 3 acts. Each act has the same shape. Setting the scene, main character, dialogue, and then go. Okay, go, depart. Each of the acts follows that shape. What stands out are the keepers of the swine and how it's a mirror story to another gospel story, different gospel, but another gospel story where you get men who keep their animals, right? It's a mirror image in reverse of that story. Notice that. And then notice verse 19 and the words of Jesus. They are the main point of the whole thing. And then bring in the background of Isaiah 65, put it all together, give it a stir, and then you come up with what this is all about. Okay? So it's something to reflect on, to ponder over on a Sunday night now, in the weeks to come. And we've got you because we are following the theme of sound-mindedness, soberly. That's what led us to this. And the man was found soberly by the crowds, by the keepers of the herds, and they were terrified at his sober, sound-mindedness. And the man, you know, we meet him and he's naked. In Act 3, he's dressed. Okay, so you can see the change in the man himself. So there you are. And I look forward to what you find out about him, what your thoughts are about why this moment in the ministry of Jesus stands out so that both Matthew, Mark, and Luke want to tell us this story and what we can take from it in terms of who Jesus is and what sound-mindedness may be. And we can share our thoughts then when we meet next on a Sunday night.